Hello and welcome to rePRO Film Festival by mama.film. I am Debbie Samples.
I'm Leela O'Connor.
And I'm Mallory Martin.
As the founders of rePRO, we want to thank the village of people who have made this festival possible, our filmmakers, special guests, partners, sponsors, and of course, our audience. You have lent your time, talents, and expertise to help amplify the voices that are so crucial in the fight for reproductive justice and bodily autonomy.
When you purchase tickets and donate to rePRO, you've become an active participant of change, as all net ticket sales and accompanying donations support our 5 beneficiary organizations.
We thank you for participating in these vitally important call to action conversations and hope you leave feeling empowered to be your own advocate in the world. Please keep women's reproductive rights at the forefront of your mind as we enter this critical election season. We're pleased to present the Let's Talk About It call to action conversation moderated by Ambreen and Molitor from Planned Parenthood's Innovation Lab.
All right. Thank you, rePRO team. As mentioned, my name is Ambreen Molitor, and I'm joined with these incredible individuals today who will be speaking about the rePRO program and then just the how they are involved in the Let's Talk About It. As a reminder, this call to action conversation is to eradicate the stigmas around the uterus, period. So I'll start by introducing our guest today. So first is Giulia Gandini. She's the director and writer of the short film My Time. We have Arielle Goldman, and she's the writer, director, and star of her film Day One. We also have Jennifer Weiss-Wolf, who is a lawyer, author of Periods Gone Public, and co-founder of Period Equity. And last but certainly not least, very excited to introduce Lynette Medley. She's the CEO and co-founder of No More Secrets, Mind, Body, Spirit, Inc. So without further ado, I'm going to just get started. And I would like to start by asking a question to Giulia and Arielle. And first of all, I want to say I loved your films. And one of the things that really made me connect with both of them is the theme of transition. So Giulia, for you, your character transitions from this moment of shame and sort of discomfort, and then evolves and transforms and transitions into just really owning her body. And Arielle, I think the transition was great in your film, where you're going through this day-to-day routine and transitioning and sort of like acknowledging your body and acknowledging like the process that's going through. So my question for both of you is, what did those transitions mean when you were thinking about the film? What does that manifest into in terms of like the message you want to relay in those narratives?
That's a difficult question. No, I mean, with my film, I guess, I mean, my film takes place over literally 10 minutes of this girl's life. It's very much like in one place, one moment, one character. And it's really one problem that she's facing, which is her period, which comes unexpected and she doesn't know what to do. And what I really wanted to play with in terms of narrative was the representation of really the blood, the menstrual blood, and what that stands for the main character at the very beginning, which is a source of anxiety and shame. And she has this like impulse to just cover it as soon as she sees it. And then at the end, spoiler alert, but at the end, having my protagonist standing proudly with her blood stain showing in front of everyone and not giving a crap about it. And that's kind of, I guess that reflects, I wanted the film to reflect how I used to feel and how I now feel towards menstrual blood, and how much shame and, you know, taboo I felt towards my own blood when I was younger, and how I only came recently in the last few years to realize that actually there's nothing to be ashamed of. And I mean, yeah, it's a realization that comes from a personal place, but it's also a realization that comes from, you know, just social awareness and incredible people like, you know, Jen, Lynette, yourself, and other filmmakers and just artists opening conversations.
That's fantastic. Beautiful.
Yeah, actually, I think that your question was like one of the main things that prompted me to make this movie, which is that I've just spent a lot of my young adult life, like sort of obsessed with the fact that women move through their whole lives literally while bleeding, and that, you know, not necessarily this country yet, but women are ruling countries and are defending bills on the House floor and working every possible level of job while experiencing a very private, intense feeling while having their periods, and that it is never acknowledged publicly, and that it purposefully so, that it has been purposefully never acknowledged, and that I also had never seen that on film before. And I just really wanted to, in the simplest way that I could, show that this experience exists simultaneously while every woman is out there working and living sort of like an alternate life and an alternate identity. And that those two things, it's absurd to me that those two things are so separate, and they shouldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where I connected with both of those films, is like, oh my God, it is a transition, right? It's transition in the way that we lead our daily lives. It's a transition of just like having it, you know, having your period for the first time, and having it just like on your first day, to then really being like, oh, this is truly what's happening. I'm transitioning into the acceptance and owning of it. And just going along the theme of transition and acceptance, I think, you know, all the directors did a fantastic job of, you know, really relaying the importance of coming to accept your body and normalizing the process it goes through, and then embracing it through like a layer of coming out with confidence and being able to, you know, in your day-to-day just sort of advocate for your body and for yourself, and thinking about that on a macro level. So like, you know, how can we become advocates on a macro level and support our community? And so maybe I could start by Lynette. I would love to, I have a specific question for you, and Jen, for you as well. But Lynn, I would love to hear more about what your thoughts are on how we can like normalize talking about periods and menopause, you know, on a community level, simply so that we can eradicate the stigma around reproductive health. You know, and what's interesting is that it's existed for so long, and surprisingly, it makes no sense, because almost half the world is menstruating at some point in their lives, right? So I would just love to hear your thoughts on how we can, as a community, just sort of normalize this conversation.
Well, I think one of the ways that we can normalize it is to talk about it in every aspect of life. It's amazing to me that we now have a woman getting ready to run as vice president. We've had a woman run as president, and we're still having this conversation. So to me, it's ironic that we're always talking about women's rights and, you know, women sticking together and empowering one another, when we as a group of women have not normalized it within our community. We're not standing up. You don't see a bunch of people standing up talking about menstrual rights. You'll see more people advocating about other rights, even around equal pay, around conversations, maybe around abortion rights, even around infant mortality rates. But how many women do you see really coming together collectively and talking about menstrual rights or normative conversation around the menses? So I think one of the things that we need to do is, as I always say, women in power positions talking about periods. I think that has to start that way. I've had conversations with state representatives and senators saying, I hear what you're saying, but I'm not going to be the one to have that conversation. I'm already isolated, or already get looks about other conversations, but I'm not comfortable talking about that. So it's very difficult when we talk about it at the micro level, when we have talking about communities who already feel impoverished, already feel as though they don't have a voice, already feel vulnerable and don't feel as though they matter. It's hard to really empower them to have this voice when they're like, I don't see anybody else talking about it. So as a community advocate, and as someone who's, you know, at the doors of these individuals, I'm intentional about bringing their conversation further and really calling people out, like, why aren't we talking about this? Why in 2020 are we still having this conversation? So I think it's really about people in power or power positions with voices to start normalizing and to stop hiding the conversation around the menses and normalizing it. Maybe I said too much, but that's how I feel.
No, that's beautiful and so well said and so poignant. And I mean, I would love, Jen, I'm sure you have more to say about this, but in particular, you know, I would love to hear more about like the laws and policies that, you know, we can shape and support for those who menstruate. And I know you have some like personal narrative around it, but also just like the work that you've been doing with period equity. Would love to hear more about that.
Sure. And I love that point that you just made, actually, Lynette, about like, it comes from the top down and it comes from the bottom up. It has to be both. If both are sort of looking to each other for a cue, we're never going to get anywhere. And that's actually sort of why I started focusing on policy as a matter of change. There's a lot of ways we can make social change, that we can make societal change. So we have this example right here. We have community engagement, we have art, we have film. So I bring sort of the boring tools of law and policy to the table. But I sort of just grew up, I mean, I'm a lawyer and I grew up thinking that like, that's how you made change. Like that's where I've invested my energy in making it. So when I stumbled onto this issue of menstrual access, which was, you know, just one of those simple light bulb moments, I went my whole life, like sort of thinking you're talking about my period as much or as little as I had to, and I have kids and I talk to them as much as or little as I had to. It wasn't anything sort of profound. I can't even remember that life actually now. But when I learned just by scrolling on my Facebook page one day that some kids in my community, they were 11 and 14, were collecting tampons and pads for our local food pantry, I was floored. I was just floored. It wasn't so much that I hadn't thought about it as a problem. I just thought, how could it be that a food pantry that knows this is a gap is relying on an 11-year-old and a 14-year-old to get them what they need? Why isn't it in their budget? Why isn't there some rule about it? Like I just couldn't understand. I couldn't like wrapping my head around that was just sort of a point of inflection that I'll never ever forget, because life has never looked the same for me ever since then. And so I started just going, well, how would you do that? Why, like, what would it look like to make sure that food pantries address this? Well, what are all the other ways we interact with and intersect with laws in our lives? Guess what? We do all the time. When you walk down the street, when you drive your car, when you go to the DMV. I mean, like everything you do has you intersecting and engaging with all of the systems that were built. And all of the systems that were built managed to ignore or not acknowledge menstruation for all kinds of reasons. I mean, even now in 2020, when we have lawmakers saying, I don't want to be the one to do that, that's the tip of the iceberg. But we've had, you know, well over a century worth of politicking in our country where none of us were at the table. So how could we rely on menstruation to be represented when our entire selves and our entire souls weren't represented? So for me, that was 2015, and I just started thinking about all the ways we could use the law and use policy to improve lives for anyone who menstruates, and whether that means making products affordable, making them accessible, making them safe, considering education, considering the whole of healthcare, considering the whole of the criminal justice system, considering the whole of the housing system, all of the ways that our bodies are part of the general structures of lives. Menstruation has to be considered too. It's just as simple as that, because if it's not, we're leaving a giant piece of the equation undone. So there's been lots and lots of progress over these years, and I'll like slow down now. You can see I'm getting kind of like riled up. But some real quick ones is there has been progress. It's not as much as we want, and it's not sort of the revolution, but it is revolutionary that 13 states have passed laws ensuring access to menstrual products for people who are incarcerated in local jails and state prisons, that 5 states have mandated that all public schools, or most public schools, must provide menstrual products to the students who attend them, that 10 states have eliminated sales tax on menstrual products in the past 10 years, 5 years, and have done so with bipartisan support. That's one that actually sort of transcends politics. Some of the other ones do too. Criminal justice reform has a way of doing so too, because it is a transpartisan movement, truly. Yeah, it's really, really fascinating that menstruation has started to occupy this very distinct and unique place in public policy making, where it's not quite as polarized or as toxic as some other issues relating to our bodies and reproduction and sexual lives. But still edgy enough to be hip or something like that, where people are willing to take it on. So not everybody has, but enough have that we have a track record to demand more.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's beautifully said. And you know, what you, Jen and Lynette, you both mentioned is, you know, there's like almost a three-sided market where it's like, it comes from a governmental perspective, it comes from community really talking about it and embracing it. And then like, you know, in the films, as we talk about, it comes from a personal perspective too. And I think a lot about that in particular this year, which is such like a, I will say insightful year. There's a lot to learn from what's happened in 2020. And I think the biggest learning lesson that we're all taking from what's happening today, you know, through the pandemic is around like the social and racial disparities that are happening.
Yes.
And we're seeing right now, right? And at Planned Parenthood, you know, we've been bullish about this topic even before the pandemic, but doubling down even more so now. You know, and the work that we do at the lab, one thing that we're doing to respond to what's happening in our nation is to provide all of the products that we build for free. And what that does is it decreases access for the products, meaning the Spot On birth control tracking app and the sex ed chatbot. And what that does is it reduces access for any community to obtain the education and the personalized sort of world of just learning about their bodies on their own, right? And so there's this idea of how can we, as a community, as folks that are really involved in this conversation, what are some ways, given COVID-19 in particular, ways that we could provide access to healthcare in some ways? And I don't know, Jen or Lynette, if you have some ideas, but yeah, I mean, I think that's something we all think about in our day-to-day is like, what can we do to provide this sort of equitability, and specifically, you know, within this conversation around equitability around reproductive health care. Yeah, I mean, I would just love to hear if you have any thoughts or ideas around that.
Well, you know, from my experience, I feel like it's always where we need to meet people where they are. I think one of the things that people historically have done is have this idea that people need to come to them and lean on them and, you know, and search them out. And you have to realize when people are living in impoverished areas, poverty, or dealing with, you know, a lot of economic deficiency, sometimes they're not able to do some of the things we take for granted, just like access to internet services. Because I'm around in the city all day long, you're doing, you know, like you said, we do 200 plus deliveries a week to homes of persons. When we go in certain regions, even when I'm trying to get on a Zoom call or something, I can't even connect. There aren't towers in certain areas. So things that we take for granted for people to be able to use a phone and be able to get on certain apps and different things and be able to navigate it, sometimes is not, you know, always the best way. So sometimes finding a community hub is important. You know, it might be a community center that's still open, or a faith-based place where even if it's not people coming together inside the building, but outside, we've been utilizing, you know, food drives and different things to be able to give products to, so that they can basically meet the needs of other people. So I think one thing that people need to realize is stop looking at things from our perspectives, but understand the realities of the communities we serve, and that one size doesn't fit all. And I think that's the best way. And start asking them. One thing that we are very intentional about, again, I would have never created a bank or a door-to-door delivery service on my own until my population started saying this is the need. So start asking them, okay, I'm doing this, because, you know, a lot of times organizations and business say, oh, we've created this, and, you know, this is what's going to happen, and this is how we're going to save, you know, our community. Start asking them what's best for them. Does this make sense for them? Is this making the best impact? How can we change it? And they usually have answers. They will say different things like, you need to do this, or this makes a better choice. And I think once we start listening to their voices and understanding their perspectives and realities, I think that's the best way to go about, you know, meeting their needs.
I love that. I love the power of not answering that question, because it's not for us to answer, but for folks that really need these services to answer. Amazing. Jen,
I want to actually, I have like this kind of fascinating example that happened in New York City when, so New York City was the first sort of major jurisdiction in the country to pass what, you know, we call this menstrual equity package that mandated provision of products in the city's schools, shelters, and jails. And it was funny because I had sort of, as I said, I sort of did this like sort of sweep of laws and tried to figure out like where the openings were. And then when I went to go meet with the city council, this is back in 2015, they were really, really excited. They're like, yeah, this is good, this is good. And then we suddenly realized we were a lawmaker and a lawyer sitting in a room, and we hadn't asked anybody. We hadn't said, how will this work for you? How does this play out in your lives? So it was kind of this like backwards style grassroots turned inside out campaign where we had a lawmaker who was ready to do it, and we had a lawyer who was ready to like write it all up, but we needed to know what it was. So we brought everybody to the table. We called it the Menstrual Equity Roundtable, and basically reached out from all across the city to everything from the after school programs to the food pantries to the health providers to the correctional association, and said, well, how does this play out in your communities? We need to know, because we've got a lawmaker here who's going to do whatever you say. And it's funny because grassroots, I mean, that's not generally the way things usually happen. It was pretty inside out and upside down. But it fueled so many relationships that and fueled also sort of a winning policy package, even though it's got a lot of gaps and there are things about it that don't work as well as they might or they could. But I suppose that's part of the bargain with policy. You get it better the next time, or you get it better for the different communities as they take it out into their own. So this provided at least like a roadmap or a template for others to go take to their cities and their communities, and figure out how to adapt it for their own needs.
Yeah, I mean, again, like the running theme between you and Lynette's responses, it really cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution. And it really needs to come from the community themselves. And that takes power to just sort of be like, we don't have the answer, and we need to really listen to the community and hear what they need, and we will adapt accordingly. And it may be that the manifestation of it is many different solutions.
Definitely.
But it's the right solution. So appreciate that. And completely, as you all know, can relate to that in the work that we do. So Arielle and Giulia, I think the other thing I was thinking about when this topic arose is thinking about how to include or make people feel like they're included in the conversation. And I think there's just this beautiful way that you all have included in the story. Like, as I was watching both of your films, I can name a time when I was having my period and I bled through my skirt, or I can name a time when I was trying to go through my day-to-day and I was just like, you know what, I need to lie down for a second and just like, embrace what's going on. And so my question to both of you was, how did the story of both of these, what were some ways that you were thinking about the way that the story is told to make it feel inclusive, where someone could, watch this and be like, this is a story about me as well, was it like the set or the tone or like the nuances? And I noticed there was very little dialogue too, which is beautiful. I think in the gaps, and again, I think there's so much there. And I would love to hear, some thoughts that you had when you were thinking about how to connect with your users, especially for, folks who are menstruating like myself, where I could look at this film and be like, oh yeah, totally. I can completely relate to that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, my experience of approaching, because this was the first short film that I wrote and directed myself. So from the very beginning, it felt incredibly personal, but at the same time, I was aware that I didn't want to create something just for the sake of watching it myself. I wanted it to connect to as many as possible. And so I guess the question for me became, how do I turn something incredibly personal, like a memory, into something that people can relate to as well? And for me, to be honest, it was just really digging into all the negatives and positives that I myself experienced, and trusting that if I was truthful about what I was telling, if I was enforcing the narrative onto anyone, and if I was enforcing my view or my opinion onto anyone, the representation of the theme, the story, the character, the menstrual blood would have come across as just genuine. And I think I've been successful with that. I'm very happy with how audiences have interacted with my film and how they've responded to my film. And it was an interesting experience as well, because when I started first pitching the idea of the film, once I had written the script, I also faced quite a lot of rejection and a lot of negative reactions. Yeah, there was quite, because I tend to send my scripts once they're written to different people, you know, friends, family, people that I don't really know that well, filmmakers, people that are not filmmakers, just to get a sense of how people are reacting to the characters and the story already before I actually go and shoot the thing. And there was quite a lot of reactions that were kind of, oh, sweet, but who cares, really? Or you know, or how is it relevant? I don't see why people would, you know, care about seeing menstrual blood at all. Or do you need the shot of the blood? I'm not so sure it's important to the story. Yeah, and I remember even just the poster of the film that I decided to go for, which is literally like, it's a pad with glitter instead of blood on top of it. There was so many people going for like, oh, you shouldn't go for that. Like, you're not gonna get into film festivals with that, you know? It's been an interesting experience making this film. I learned a lot from it.
I think that what I imagine is in the script, there's very little dialogue, but there's probably a lot of story around the tone and setting that you were bringing to your narrative. And I would love to hear how you were trying to connect in the absence of dialogue and with the presence of just like, you know, everything in your narrative and film as well.
Yeah, well, likewise to Giulia, when I first was writing this script, my mom, who I think of as being, you know, like a real powerhouse of a woman, the first thing she said to me was like, in fact, I think she made that face. She was like, who wants to watch something about your period? Like, are you sure that's what you want to make a movie about? And just to show like the indoctrination, even a part of me then went, I don't know, maybe she's right. But I kept with it. And intentionally so, like it was a very quiet film and very dialogueless, because I think the experience is isolating in itself of going through, you know, your period once a month. And that like little bit of, you know, what happens when you wake up and all the preparation that you have to go through before actually really starting your day and entering the world with everyone else, I felt like was the one thing that I really knew personally and could tell from the back of my hand, like backwards and forwards, because it's been happening since I was 14. And so that for me was just like the guiding factor in writing it. And then all of the, I just really wanted to explore like as honest as possible, the physicality, how your body feels, you know, every shape and form that you take. And also I, at 30 years of age, started using a period app to track my periods because I had never done it before in my life. And I only started doing that because my sister and friends of mine were starting to get pregnant, and for their first time in their life started to understand what your cycle meant and started to track that. And it dawned on me, you know, that like it's such a shameful flaw in our education system that we teach young women and young men, young boys, about the female anatomy strictly through the lens of pregnancy and in a fear-based way, right? Like it's all about not getting pregnant. And the only thing that I can remember from health class really is like the diagram of the fallopian tubes, where the egg goes up the fallopian tubes and how the sperm meets them. At no point did I ever learn like what is happening in your body when you have a cramp, what that's called, what the shedding of the uterine lining looks like, nothing, right? And so there's like, I just think it's such a flaw in our education that we don't teach girls about their own biology until they reach a certain level of, you know, hopefully until they reach a certain level of maturity and preparation in their own lives to think about it through the lens of birth and pregnancy. And that's not, you know, that's a clue to how women are seen in the world, in first world countries and third world countries. And I think that for me, like it definitely has to start in educating everyone to know how a woman's anatomy works, because it's beneficial from the start of life, not just, you know, when they turn 25 and decide to have children.
It's funny, even sort of a little separate from education, since I've been doing this advocacy and I'll do interviews or things, you know, where people talk with each other. So I talk about the issue a lot. There's like this kind of like standard basic, you know, starting question. People always say, well, let's just start with like, what's your either a first period story or a worst period story? And I always find myself having to educate and instruct that that's almost the least interesting thing. That as a 52-year-old, I can tell you stories about what it meant to not want to be pregnant, what it meant to want to be pregnant, what it meant to have a miscarriage, what it meant to be pregnant, what it meant to be postpartum. And it's all related to aspects of our bodies and our cycles. And it's funny, like even sort of the hip news media that thinks they're getting it quite right. It's always just kind of this like barely scraping the surface of how meaningful all of this is.
Yeah. I completely agree. And I think, you know, since we have just a few minutes left, I think the best way to end this is kind of jumping off what you were just saying, Jen. Like, what is the story that you think should be talked about in terms of like, not your first period or not like the worst period, but like, what are the personalized moments that you think would be actually educational and not anecdotal, right? Arielle, I think you hit it a little bit when you were talking about it's the education of what exactly happens when your body goes through the period too. So I don't know, I'll leave it open to the panel. And if any, I feel like I would love to hear from all of you on this question. Like, what do you think is the main sort of education piece or story that you think will go a long way for people to really understand what we're trying to do here when we destigmatize the topic of periods and essentially having a uterus?
Well, I would say that I know one thing that we do as an organization is called Period and Not Respected Dot, and it's a Menses Awareness Education Program, and it's really talking about the cycle and what it is, and the empowerment and the power that, you know, bodies who have uteruses have, you know, because of all the strength that it has and everything, and really to negate all of the shaming, because most young people, when you ask them from the beginning when they got their menses, what was the first message? You know, nothing was positive. You know, it wasn't this celebratory message. It was almost about it's nasty, or you need to do this, or you're a woman, or you can get pregnant, all of these things, but not talking about what the cycle is, what it does to your body, and how empowering it is as, you know, as a female or as a, you know, person who menstruates, you know, what it does. And I think that's one of the main things. Also, education to all bodies. I think one thing that we do is that we'll have a menses awareness conversation with female identified persons and not male identified persons. And then you want to normalize and destigmatize, and you can't, because they're having a whole different set of conversations and messages. And then females are having a whole different message. So we have to bridge the gap. We have to be able to have these conversations and be able to normalize and destigmatize and make people realize this is a normal, natural part of life. This is not something that it amazes me that we can have a poop emoji and we can, you know, float on a poop float through the, you know, in the beach, but we will not. I mean, people will hide, you know, pads and tampons and menstrual cups, but we'll walk around with toilet paper when we're talking about, you know, that type of, and that's because, and I hate to say it, I think it's just a patriarchal way of society that anything is just to a female's body is diminished as something that, you know, doesn't make sense, or just not something that's empowered. So I think that's what the conversations need to be about.
Totally.
And even more in marginalized communities. I hate to say it, because language and processes and programs do not go to these communities. So they're already dealing with all these stigmas on top of dealing with something around a menstrual cycle. So I think that's what I would say, educate and awareness.
I love that. I mean, I agree with you that the conversation always ends up in the like values, judgments categories, rather than
Definitely.
like these are the facts, right? And I think this is probably aging myself, but I distinctly remember getting sex education, and we talked about like sex. And then when it came to periods, we asked the boys
to
like,
leave the room.
Mm-hmm. Why? I mean, like, you know, like there's something there, that, you know, and that brings up your point of like, it has to be with everyone. And I also think it divides genders, right? It doesn't acknowledge the spectrum of gender identity, right? So I totally and wholeheartedly appreciate that answer. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add.
Yeah, I'll just say, like, I 100% agree. There should absolutely be emojis that represent tampons, cups, you know, anything. It's crazy. I've never even thought about that before. But I just feel like it has to be like attacked on all sides, right? Sort of in the way that this conversation is going, like in terms of, you know, I don't know if you saw, I think it was yesterday, there was this story in the New York Times about a food delivery company in India. I forget what it's, Zomato, I forget what it's called, but the CEO, who's a man, enacted a policy that gave female employees a 10-day period leave. And I've never even I haven't heard of that. And I haven't even heard of that happening in the United States, first of all. So I think that companies and like, you know, public brands need to take their lead on that and enact similar policies. And I think that the arts, you know, the more visibility that we can have on the woman's body and how it works from start to finish, as opposed to just thinking of a woman's worth and necessary knowledge beginning at a certain time, the better. And I just feel like we have to be as vocal as possible in our own little circles, and then in whatever possible way you can, moving outwards.
I also love that. I love that you talk about language, right? And language could be emoji to like language and in film, where like someone can feel like, oh, this is actually a conversation I could have because it's represented. And those small nuances go a long way, right? You know, for Spot On, for example, for the period and birth control tracking app, this is so nuanced, but it goes a long way, and we get like positive app reviews about it all the time. Our app is not pink and it doesn't have flowers, and we get so much love for that in a way that like we didn't anticipate it. It's like a friendly surprise, but you know, it's those subtle things. It's like using color to distinguish like an inclusive environment, using emoji to talk about and express what you're thinking and feeling, and you know, through that it becomes like film, and it becomes you know, employment policies, right? Like all of these small things become part of like your day-to-day dialogue, essentially. So I also love that answer. It starts subtly and it goes a long way.
And if I could just adding one more thing, you know, like we have this conversation here because as bad as we feel that it is here, like in other parts of the world, people believe insane things about women who are menstruating, down to like superstition that it's bad luck to be around women who are bleeding, that it can make other people sick, you know, like those, and those are real things that are at the detriment of young girls exploring education, women trying to go to work. And so the conversation just has to like keep opening up for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Jen, Giulia, I don't know if you have any final thoughts, but would love to hear from both of you as well.
I mean, I guess I agree with everything that has been said so far. I feel like for myself, well, because I am a filmmaker and I think and I perceive things in a very visual way, it's really, really about not making something a taboo on screen. Like, so much of my belief system growing up was based on media that I consumed growing up, and even more so now with younger generations having access to, you know, not only VHS tapes, but you know, like all social media, and like there's an oversaturation of information and visuals coming at you on an everyday basis. And for me as a filmmaker, it's really, really important that I'm honest in representing issues, themes that relate to the female body in a way that it's very straightforward and true, because that's not how I perceived a lot of films that I watched growing up. And so, yeah, it has to do with just portraying how things truly are, without the fear, really, of people going against you for doing that.
Absolutely. Jen, do you have any final thoughts?
Oh, sorry. I mean, you know, all of this it's every single aspect of this movement requires sort of all of our beings. It is about storytelling. It is about art. It is about communication. It is about human interaction. It is about power. It is about politics. So it's just kind of heartening to me every time I get to have that conversation with people who bring so many different facilities and gifts to the table, because all of that together is how we will, you know, create this full-on societal change. Arielle mentioned workplace policy and period leave at workplace policy. We don't have time to get into it there. It's really actually a complicated topic. And I've been sort of watching what's happening out of that news story in India with great interest. But anyway, I would say that when we all bring sort of all of these sort of skills and ideas and communities to the table is when we will sort of see the change that we hope for.
Yeah. That is a perfectly positive note to end on and in time. So first of all, I just want to thank you all again for participating. And then for the audience that is watching, if you want a recap of the organizations that you want to support around this topic, please visit day 4 on the rePRO website. Also, try to make plans to support the rePRO Film Festival. You could purchase films, you could attend more of these call to action conversations. And if you need more info, you could go to repromamafilm.org. And just a reminder that all ticket sales are donated to the reproductive justice advocacy organizations. Thank you all again. I would love to stay in touch. I would love to follow your movements, your art, and please let us all know how we could help and stay involved. And with that, I will let everyone go. Be well, be safe, and thanks again.
Thanks. Thank you. Bye-bye.